The hidden cost of emotional reactivity there is a quiet vulnerability that most people carry without realizing it. It does not appear in obvious weaknesses, nor does it reveal itself in moments of calm conversation. It appears in the moments when something unexpected happens, when someone criticizes, challenges, provokes, or dismisses them. In those moments, reactions emerge almost automatically. The voice becomes sharper, the tone changes, the body shifts, and the mind begins rushing to defend itself. To the person experiencing the reaction, it feels natural. It feels justified. Anger feels like strength. Defensiveness feels like protection. Frustration feels like honesty. Yet beneath this surface response lies something far more revealing. Every reaction quietly exposes the inner mechanisms of the mind. It shows exactly where emotional pressure can be applied. What most people fail to notice is that reactions are rarely private events. They are visible signals. When someone provokes you and your emotional state changes immediately, the environment learns something about you. It learns what disturbs your balance. It learns which words can disrupt your focus. It learns how quickly your internal stability can be shaken. Human beings are constantly observing each other, even when they appear distracted or indifferent. Conversations, disagreements, and conflicts all become moments of psychological observation. In these moments, reactions become information. A raised voice reveals sensitivity. A defensive explanation reveals insecurity. A sudden burst of anger reveals where composure collapses. The surprising truth is that emotional reactions rarely strengthen a person's position. They often do the opposite. When someone reacts strongly, attention shifts away from the original issue and toward the reaction itself. Instead of appearing controlled and deliberate, the person begins to appear influenced by the behavior of others. This is the hidden cost of emotional reactivity. The moment a reaction becomes predictable, it quietly transfers power outward. The person who can anticipate your reaction can influence the direction of the interaction. They do not need authority, status, or even intelligence to do this. All they need is the ability to press the emotional points that trigger your responses. Most individuals never notice how often this dynamic occurs. They assume their reactions are expressions of personality or honesty. They believe reacting strongly demonstrates conviction. Yet the individual who carefully observes human behavior begins to notice a different pattern. The most stable individuals are rarely the most reactive ones. They experience the same situations as everyone else. They hear criticism. They encounter disrespect. They face pressure and disagreement. But instead of reacting immediately, something subtle happens inside their thinking process. A pause appears. Awareness becomes active. Instead of allowing emotion to dictate the response, they observe the emotion first. This pause is small, almost invisible from the outside. Yet psychologically it creates a powerful shift. In that moment of observation, the reaction loses its automatic control. The mind gains time to evaluate what is happening. Words can be chosen carefully. Silence becomes an option. The emotional impulse no longer dictates the outcome. Over time, this discipline changes how others interact with the individual. When people notice that their attempts to provoke reactions fail, they become less certain about how to influence the situation. The predictable emotional pattern disappears. Without predictable reactions, manipulation becomes difficult. What emerges instead is a quiet form of psychological distance. The individual is still present in the interaction, still aware of what is being said or done, but their internal state is no longer easily disrupted. They become less emotionally accessible to external pressure. This is the first step toward becoming untouchable in difficult situations. Not through dominance, not through intimidation, but through the simple refusal to allow external behavior to dictate internal balance, the quiet rule of psychological stability. In moments of tension, something subtle happens in almost every room. Conversations become sharper, voices rise slightly, body language tightens, and the emotional temperature begins to climb. Most people feel the shift immediately. Their thoughts accelerate, their attention narrows, and the urge to respond quickly becomes difficult to resist. What appears on the surface as a disagreement or stressful situation is actually something deeper. It is a psychological environment where emotional reactions begin to move faster than careful thinking. When this happens, people stop observing clearly. They begin reacting. This is where an important pattern begins to reveal itself. When pressure increases, most individuals move in the same direction. They talk faster. They defend themselves more strongly. They try to explain, argue, justify, or prove something. The instinct to regain control of the situation pushes them toward immediate expression. Yet occasionally, someone behaves differently. Instead of accelerating with the emotional atmosphere, they slow down. Their voice remains steady. Their posture does not shift dramatically. Their words become fewer, not more. While others react quickly, they take a moment to observe what is unfolding. This difference may appear small, but psychologically, it changes the entire dynamic of the situation. When someone reacts quickly, their thinking becomes visible and predictable. Emotions guide their words. Their responses follow the pressure of the moment. But the person who remains calm begins to see things others cannot. Because their attention is not consumed by emotional urgency, they are able to observe the behavior of everyone involved. They notice tone changes. They notice contradictions. They notice patterns in the way people argue, defend themselves, or attempt to gain influence. While reactive minds are focused on expressing themselves, the calm mind is quietly collecting information. Observation becomes the foundation of psychological stability. Most people assume emotional calmness means indifference or weakness. In reality, it often signals the opposite. When someone remains composed while others become reactive, it shows that their thinking process is not controlled by the surrounding atmosphere. They are able to maintain clarity even when the situation becomes emotionally charged. This clarity creates a subtle advantage. When emotions dominate a conversation, perception becomes distorted. People exaggerate problems, misinterpret intentions, and respond impulsively to statements that were never meant to provoke them. Their focus narrows around defending themselves or winning the argument. In doing so, they lose the ability to see the larger structure of what is happening. The calm observer sees this structure. They notice who is speaking emotionally and who is speaking strategically. They notice which arguments are driven by frustration rather than logic. They notice how quickly others become defensive when challenged. These observations create a deeper understanding of the situation than emotional participants can achieve. Over time, the disciplined mind develops a habit of stepping slightly outside the emotional movement of a situation. Instead of being carried by it, they watch it unfold. This perspective allows them to respond with intention rather than impulse. Their responses become quieter but more precise. Their words become fewer but more effective. Instead of reacting to every statement, they choose carefully when to speak, and when silence provides greater influence. The quiet rule of psychological stability is rarely discussed, yet it becomes obvious once observed. In environments where most people lose emotional balance, the person who maintains calm awareness begins to stand apart, not because they dominate the conversation, but because they are the only one in the room whose thinking remains clear while everyone else is reacting. The discipline of internal boundaries. One of the most misunderstood aspects of emotional control is the belief that strong reactions are unavoidable. Many people assume that when something upsetting happens, an insult, criticism, disrespect, or pressure, the emotional response that follows is simply part of human nature. Anger appears, frustration builds, and the reaction feels inevitable. Yet the real conflict does not begin with the external situation. It begins internally, in the brief moment between emotion and action. Most people never notice this moment because it happens quickly. An event occurs, emotion rises instantly, and the reaction follows without interruption. Words are spoken, tone changes, expressions harden, and the mind begins defending itself almost automatically. The sequence feels natural because it has been repeated thousands of times throughout life. But hidden inside that sequence is a decision point that most individuals never recognize. The appearance of emotion is not the same as the decision to act on it. Anger may appear, but anger does not force speech. Frustration may appear, but frustration does not force action. The reaction that follows emotion is often a learned pattern rather than a necessity. Over time, the mind becomes conditioned to treat emotions as commands rather than signals. This is where emotional discipline begins. When a person begins observing their reactions closely, they start to notice something surprising. Emotions rise quickly, but they also fluctuate quickly. A surge of irritation might feel intense in the moment, but if it is not immediately expressed, it often begins to soften within seconds. The emotional wave rises, reaches its peak, and then slowly begins to settle. Most people never experience this process because they release the emotion immediately through reaction. By reacting instantly, the emotional state becomes reinforced. Words strengthen the feeling, tone amplifies it. The interaction escalates. Instead of fading naturally, the emotion grows stronger because it has been given expression and attention. The disciplined mind begins interrupting this cycle. Rather than suppressing emotions or pretending they do not exist, the individual learns to observe them as internal signals. Anger becomes something to notice. Frustration becomes something to examine. The emotional reaction is acknowledged, but not immediately acted upon. This observation creates what can be called an internal boundary. The boundary does not eliminate emotions. Instead, it separates the emotional impulse from the behavioral response. When this boundary becomes strong, a person begins to experience emotions without automatically translating them into reactions. This is a difficult shift at first because it contradicts the instinctive urge to express feelings immediately. Many people equate emotional expression with honesty or authenticity. They believe that reacting instantly proves confidence or strength. Yet when reactions become predictable, they also become controllable. If someone knows exactly how you will respond when provoked, they gain a subtle advantage. They can predict your emotional movements. They can anticipate your tone, your words, and your behavior. Your reactions become part of the environment they can navigate. The person who builds internal boundaries disrupts this predictability. Emotions may still appear, but they no longer dictate behavior automatically. Instead, the individual pauses. They observe what is happening inside their mind before deciding what action, if any, is necessary. Sometimes the most effective response becomes silence. Sometimes the situation no longer deserves the energy it once demanded. Through repeated discipline, something begins to change. Situations that once produced strong reactions begin to lose their emotional urgency. Words that once felt provocative begin to feel ordinary. The mind becomes less sensitive to pressure because it has learned that emotions do not require immediate obedience. This transformation is gradual, but its effect is profound. The individual begins to move through difficult situations with a different form of awareness. Instead of reacting automatically, they choose their responses deliberately. And with each moment of restraint, the boundary between feeling and reaction becomes stronger inside the mind, the authority of a mind that cannot be disturbed. There is a moment in the development of emotional discipline when something subtle begins to change. It is not dramatic, and it rarely feels like a sudden transformation. Instead, it appears gradually through repeated experiences. Situations that once triggered strong reactions begin to feel less urgent. Words that once carried the power to provoke irritation now pass through the mind without leaving the same emotional impact. At first, the difference is barely noticeable. A remark that once would have triggered defensiveness now receives a calm response. A disagreement that previously would have escalated into frustration now becomes something to observe rather than react to. The environment around you remains the same, but your relationship to it begins to shift. What begins to emerge is a form of psychological distance. This distance does not mean indifference or emotional numbness. The individual still hears criticism, still encounters disagreement, and still notices attempts by others to provoke or influence them. The difference is that these external events no longer penetrate as deeply into the internal state of the mind. Instead of reacting instantly, the individual observes first. This observation creates a powerful change in perception. When emotional reactions slow down, awareness becomes sharper. Small details that once went unnoticed begin to appear more clearly. The tone of someone's voice, the intention behind certain words, the emotional patterns in conversations, all of these become easier to recognize when the mind is not consumed by reacting. Over time, this clarity produces an unexpected effect on the surrounding environment. People begin adjusting their behavior around someone who cannot be easily disturbed. When others attempt to provoke emotional reactions and those reactions do not appear, uncertainty replaces predictability. The usual emotional patterns that guide many interactions begin to dissolve. In most social situations, people rely on predictable reactions. They expect anger when they insult someone. They expect defensiveness when they criticize. They expect frustration when pressure increases. These expectations create a psychological structure within conversations and conflicts. But when someone remains calm in situations where others anticipate reactions, that structure begins to break. Without emotional responses to guide the interaction, the environment becomes less certain for those attempting to influence it. Attempts to provoke lose their effectiveness. Emotional pressure loses its direction. The person who cannot be easily disturbed becomes difficult to manipulate because their reactions are no longer predictable. This is where emotional independence begins transforming into quiet authority. Authority in this sense is not created through force, dominance, or intimidation. It emerges through stability. When others notice that someone remains composed under pressure, they begin to interpret that composure as strength. The calm individual becomes a point of psychological steadiness in situations where others lose balance. Over time, this stability changes how interactions unfold. Conversations become more measured. Challenges are presented more carefully. Even conflict begins to slow when directed towards someone whose reactions are controlled and deliberate. Yet the most important transformation does not occur in how others behave. It occurs internally. The individual who has learned to govern their reactions begins to experience the world differently. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Pressure that once triggered emotional turbulence now appears as something that can be examined calmly. The mind becomes less reactive and more deliberate. And with this change comes a realization that many people never reach. The greatest form of control does not come from influencing others. It comes from mastering the internal responses that others once had the power to provoke. Because when your emotional balance no longer depends on external behavior, the external world quietly loses its ability to control you.